Assalamu alaikum. The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine by Miko Pilet. This book is about the Palestine-Israel conflict from the perspective of an Israeli Jew. Miko Pilet is the son of General Mati Pilet, who is famous in Palestine as a hero of the 1967 war. After leaving military service, General Pilet became a professor of Arabic literature at the Tel Aviv University. He also played a prominent role as a peace activist who advocated Palestinian rights and peaceful coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians. It is only towards the end of the book that Miko Pilet tells us what brought about this change in his father. Miko Pilet, like other Israelis, served in the military. It wasn't until his niece, Smadar, was killed in a suicide bombing attack that he started questioning Israel's policy towards Palestinians. He became restless and started looking for ways to bring peace to his troubled homeland. Thus began his journey to know more about the other. The one big major obstacle he had to overcome was fear of Palestinians, people who he and all Israelis have been taught are their enemies. Those people wanted all Jews dead. He was gripped with fear the first time he ventured alone into a Palestinian town. He was convinced the Arabs would attack, beat him up, and kill him, which of course did not happen. What I find most interesting and enlightening is the non-violent resistance movement by the Palestinians. I admit that I've never heard of it until I read this book. What the mainstream media often tells us is about the militant terrorist Hamas who is determined to destroy Israel. Then there is also the Bereavement Forum that brings together Israelis and Palestinians who have lost family members in the conflict. People who know the pain of losing their loved ones get together to not only help each other heal, but also to find peaceful means to end the conflict. Reading about how committed these Palestinians and Israelis are to establishing peaceful coexistence is very touching and gives hope that one day the occupation of Palestine will come to an end and the people, Arabs and Jews, will learn to trust one another and live together in peace again. My favorite part of the book is when Pilet invited his friend and Palestinian peace activist Nader to his home. Their young children happily played together. Pilet pointed at them and said, "Look, Israeli and Palestinian kids who don't know they're supposed to be enemies." The General's Son is a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the Palestine-Israel conflict. In the description, there is a link to a related book by Ilan Pape. There are also links to online bookstores if you would like to buy the books. If you like listening to me babbling about books, hit subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. From Beirut to Jerusalem by Ang Sui Tai. The author was born in Malaysia. Later on, her family moved to Singapore where she grew up. She was a Christian and the church taught her that the Jews were God's chosen people and their return to Israel was a verification of a biblical prophecy. That and her sympathy for the Jews because of the Holocaust sealed her support for Israel. She was prejudiced towards Palestinians who, according to the church, were terrorists and an old enemy. She went to medical school, graduated, and later migrated to the UK where she worked as a doctor. Her journey from a staunch Christian supporter of Israel to a peace activist and friend of Palestinians began in 1982. She watched the horror of Israeli invasion and bombardment of Lebanon on TV. The killing of women and children shook her to the core. She resigned from her hospital and went to Beirut as a surgeon volunteer. In Beirut, she served at the Gaza hospital. Palestinian refugees named their hospital after their town in Palestine. It's a symbol of longing for their homeland from where they were expelled by the Zionist colonialists. Many of the camp residents were refugees who fled the ethnic cleansing in 1948. It was near the Sabra and Shatila camps. While there, she experienced the kindness of the Palestinians. She had never met a people kinder or more generous than the Palestinians, despite them having so little. She also saw their courage and resolution, patience and resistance against Israeli aggression and occupation. She was working in the hospital when the Israeli army encircled Sabra and Shatila and coordinated the Phalangist militia who entered the camps and massacred the people. Children, women, and the elderly were brutally murdered. What she witnessed there turned her into an advocate for the Palestinian cause. After returning to the UK, she founded Medical Aid for Palestinians. Reflecting on the Palestinian tragedy, she wondered why Palestinians must suffer to accommodate the victims of the Nazi persecution and European racism. You must read this book. Below there are links to an interview with the author. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you. Assalamualaikum. Israeli Apartheid, A Beginner's Guide by Ben White. This book starts with a definition of apartheid as specified in the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid in the UN General Assembly Resolution 3068. Then, the author compares the similarities and differences between the apartheid policies in South Africa and Israel. He pointed out Israel's association with apartheid South Africa was long-standing, and how the South African Jewish community heavily funded Israel in its infancy. White traces the history of the occupation that started in 1897 and explains why Israel is a state of some citizens. About half of the Palestinian population are not ruled by Israel. They are displaced Palestinian refugees, and their descendants are denationalized, expelled, and forcibly kept out of their homeland. The author includes shocking first-person Palestinian testimonies. For example, testimony of an elderly lady who suffered the trauma and indignity of Israeli bulldozers razing her home and was later presented with the bill. White discusses the occupation and separation wall and how it fragments Palestine. Israel relentlessly built colonies in the occupied territories to steal Palestinian land and fragment it. Special roads that were built for the exclusive use of Jewish colonizers achieved the same purpose. Israel introduces measures to prevent non-Jews from participating in the political, social, economic, and cultural life of the country, including the right to live and return, right to a nationality, and right to freedom of movement and residence. Regarding the right to life and liberty, the author shows that nearly 1 million Palestinians have been imprisoned by Israel, including children. Every year, Israel detains up to 700 Palestinian children, and torture is common. The author discusses the boycott, divest and sanction BTS campaign as a strategy to end the occupation. This book wouldn't be complete without a discussion of how to move forward by discussing efforts by Palestinian and Israeli organizations to end the occupation peacefully. White concludes that Israel's oppression of the Palestinians is not only comparable to apartheid South Africa, it's actually worse. This book is compact, less than 200 pages, and full of facts presented in a way that is easy to understand. Below, there are two links, one to the author talking about the second edition of this book. The other is a link to a lecture given by the author. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you. Assalamualaikum. In this book, Professor Ilan Pape discusses 10 myths about Israel. I'll give you an overview of the 10 points. And if you're interested in the in-depth discussion and analysis, you can read the book. Okay, first myth. Palestine was an empty land. Palestine has been a recognized country since Roman times. There is a wide consensus among scholars that it was the Romans who granted the land the name Palestina. Second myth. The Jews were a people without a land. The Christian world, due to its own interests, supported the idea that Jews must one day return to the Holy Land. Let's keep in mind that Christian Europe had been trying to get rid of Jews for centuries. Third myth, Zionism is Judaism. The root of Zionism can be found in the 18th century. The Zionists redefined Judaism as a national movement and the need to colonize Palestine. Fourth myth, Zionism is not colonialism. The Zionist leaders told the early settlers that the locals were not natives and had no right to the land. Zionism is a settler colonial movement. Fifth myth, the Palestinians voluntarily left their homeland in 1948. There are many evidence to the contrary. Sixth myth, the June 1967 war was a war of no choice. The war was launched based on the pretext of a threat against Israel. Seventh myth, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. This is false, and the author explains why Israel is not a democracy. The eighth myth is about the Oslo mythologies. The ninth myth is the Gaza mythologies. The author presents 3 myths that have misled public opinion about the ongoing violence in Gaza. The 10th myth, the two-state solution is the only way forward. The author explains why this is an improbable and infeasible solution. Below, there is a link to an interview with the author regarding this book. Do have a watch. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you. Assalamualaikum. They called me a lioness, a Palestinian girl fight for freedom by Ahed Tamimi and Dina Takruri. Ahed Tamimi became known worldwide after a video of her slapping an IDF soldier who shot her cousin went viral. She was arrested, interrogated, and put on trial in a military court. Yep, that's right. In apartheid Israel, Palestinians are tried in a military court. The trials are never fair and the conviction rate is. This is one of many Israel's tactics to break the Palestinian spirit. Ahed ended up spending 8 months in prison. She was not the only minor in the overcrowded prison. It was common for 6 girls to share a small cell with only 4 beds. One of the prisoners was a woman named Khalida, who made sure the girls continue their high school education and graduate. They managed to get around various restrictions imposed by the prison authority to prevent them from completing their education. Khalida even took the initiative to provide a course on international law so that when the girls are released, they will be better equipped to resist their colonizer. It is sad how Palestinian parents know that it's not a matter of if their children at some point will be arrested and thrown in an Israeli prison. It's a matter of when. And they prepare their children about what to do when they are kidnapped by IDF. This book is not only a hate story. It's a story about Palestinian struggle to free their land from the Zionist colonization. The Israeli government go out of their way to make life as difficult as possible for Palestinians. The objective is to break their spirit and will to resist so that Palestinians will finally give up and accept their subjugation. Or they leave for another country. The goal is to force them to leave their land. Here's an example of how Israel makes daily life difficult for Palestinians. The IDF erects checkpoints randomly and detain Palestinians indefinitely for no reason, sometimes for hours. Going to work or school becomes a daily challenge. A trip that should take 15 minutes could end up taking hours. Palestinians are required to apply for a permit to build a house or build an extension to an existing house. When they apply, it's almost always rejected. Young Palestinian couples find that they cannot build a house and at the same time cannot expand their family home to accommodate their growing family. So where are they supposed to live? The law gives Israeli authority the power to confiscate a Palestinian home and kick them out, making them homeless. The house is then given to a Jewish family. The IDF brutally and violently suppressed peaceful protests. Unarmed civilians are shot at using live bullets. There is no justice for Palestinians murdered in cold blood because the Israeli courts always clear the soldiers of any wrongdoing, even when there is overwhelming evidence of misconduct. During the weekly peaceful protests at her village, Ahed got to know several Israeli activists who are against the occupation of Palestine. They gave her hope. If they could stand in solidarity with Palestinians and criticize Israel, perhaps in time other Israelis would as well. Through them, she learned that the problem was not with the Jewish people, but with Zionism. Read this memoir if you want to understand the depth of injustice that has been perpetrated against the Palestinian people. Despite all they've been through, Palestinians don't think of themselves as victims of oppression. They think of themselves as freedom fighters. Below, there is a link to Dina Takruri interviewing Ahed Tamimi. There are also links to other books about Palestine. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Did you know that before the 1967 war, US paid little attention to Israel because it did not want to jeopardize its relationship with Arab countries? The American Jewish elite distanced itself from Israel because they did not want their loyalty to the US questioned. American Jews made a point of towing US official foreign policy because it facilitated assimilation and access to power. That changed after Israel won the 1967 war and US started to see it as a strategic asset in the Middle East. Once again, the Jewish elite toed the line and supported US foreign policy. And Israel at peace with its neighbors would be worthless. Only an Israel beholden to the US would be useful, because then the US Jewish leaders could act as the spokesman for American imperial ambition. After the war, American Jews exploited the Nazi Holocaust as the perfect weapon for deflecting criticism of Israel. For the American Jewish elite, the Holocaust performed the same function as Israel. It is another chip in a high-stake power game. After World War II, the Nazi Holocaust was not cast as a uniquely Jewish event, nor was it a historically unique event. It was only after the 1967 war that the Nazi Holocaust became unique and without parallel in history. The Jews were not the Nazis' only victims. The communists were the first political victims. The handicapped were the first genocide victims. The Nazis systematically murdered about 500,000 gypsies, which is a proportional loss to the Jewish genocide, but some Holocaust writers insisted that the gypsies did not fall victim to the same genocidal onslaught as Jews. This denial of other Nazi victims is meant to preserve an exclusive Jewish franchise over the Holocaust. The number of Holocaust survivors at war's end was about 100,000. Because enduring the camps became a crown of honor, many Jews who spent the war elsewhere represented themselves as camp survivors. A strong motive behind this misrepresentation was monetary. The post-war German government provided compensation to Jews who had been in ghettos or camps. Many Jews fabricated their stories to meet this eligibility. Much later, Holocaust survivors was redefined to include those who evaded the Nazis. For example, 1,000 Polish Jews who found refuge in the Soviet Union after the Nazi invaded Poland were also designated Holocaust survivor. In 1952, Germany signed 3 agreements to compensate Jewish victims. The German government negotiated financial settlement with the Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany and allocated $10 million annually for 12 years for Jewish victims who fell through the cracks in the compensation process. The Claims Conference initially said that the money would be used for Jews persecuted by the Nazi. Later on, it annulled the agreement and used the money for the rehabilitation of Jewish communities instead of Jewish victims. What benefits the actual victims received were indirect and incidental. The Claims Conference even tried to appropriate for itself denationalized Jewish properties in the former East Germany worth hundreds of millions of dollars that rightfully belong to living Jewish heirs. That's not the only incident of the organized American Jewry robbing its own people. The author says, when Jewish elite rob Jewish survivors, no ethical issues arise. It's just about money. In 1955, an Israeli journalist cited a document, misread, it turned out, that Swiss banks still held Holocaust-era Jewish accounts with billions of dollars. WJC leapt at the opportunity to flex its muscle. Switzerland was easy prey. Few would sympathize with rich Swiss bankers against needy Holocaust survivors. More importantly, Swiss banks were very vulnerable to economic pressure from the US. The Holocaust industry orchestrated a shameless vilification campaign against the Swiss. In 1996, the Swiss banks agreed to establish an investigative committee and abide by its finding. The Holocaust industry continued to mount pressure for a final settlement. The Swiss pleaded that a settlement should await the Commission's finding. After all, it was WJC that originally called for an investigation. The truth is, the Holocaust industry stood to lose from the findings, even if only a few claimants ultimately proved legit. The claim against the Swiss banks would lose credibility. If the legit claimants were identified, the Swiss banks would be obliged to compensate only them, not the Jewish organizations. The Holocaust industry forced Switzerland to settle because time was of essence. Needy Holocaust survivors were dying every day. After the Swiss agreed to a settlement, the agency miraculously passed. More than a year later, there was still no distribution plan. As of December 1999, less than half of the $200 million had been distributed to actual victims. After the lawyers' fees were paid, the Swiss money flowed into the coffers of worthy Jewish organizations. Only the lowest of the low would take advantage of its own people for profit. That was what the Holocaust industry did, took advantage of Holocaust survivors. If the reparation monies were paid to the actual survivors, the amount was pitiful compared to the amount paid to lawyers and the Jewish organizations who claimed to fight for the survivors. The Holocaust industry may yet turn out to be the greatest robbery in history, says the author. I highly recommend this book. You can get it using the links in the description. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. The Last Earth, a Palestinian story by Ramzi Baroud. I tend to feel deeply, which is why this book was emotionally difficult to read. I don't think anyone who has never experienced war can truly understand its horrors. Can I even begin to imagine what it must feel like to watch my home destroyed, to see people I know murdered, to flee to save my life, to become a refugee? Ramzi Baroud meticulously collected and recorded the experience of Palestinian refugees and those forced to live in exile, and tells their stories in this book. It's about the Nakba, stolen land, stolen home, shattered dreams, and hope of returning to what is rightfully theirs. When war broke out in Syria, Palestinian refugees were once again displaced. Can you imagine being made a refugee twice? Despite all the hardships and tragedies, Palestinians have kept on fighting and holding on to their hope that justice will prevail and they will return to their land. Many still keep the key to the house they were forced to flee from, even though the house no longer exists, long ago demolished to build new houses for illegal settlers who stole their homeland. I am awed by their courage and resilience. Dr. Norman Finkelstein was spot on when he said, "Today, almost everything is made in China, except courage. It's made in Palestine." This is the history of Palestine told by Palestinians. More information about this must-read book is in the description. Assalamu alaikum. This book begins by examining the ancient origins of Jerusalem, exploring how it became a central part of Jewish religious identity. It delves into how King David established the city and the construction of Solomon's temple, which became the spiritual heart of Judaism. Jerusalem was seen as the city of God, deeply intertwined with the Jewish people's covenant with Yahweh. As the book progresses, it discusses Jerusalem's importance to Christianity after the life, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus. Jerusalem became a pilgrimage site for early Christians. It details the early Christian community in Jerusalem and how the city's sacred spaces, such as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, became pivotal in Christian worship. It also discusses the transformation of Jerusalem during the Roman Empire and later under Byzantine rule. It examines the Muslim connection to Jerusalem, starting with the Prophet Muhammad's night journey and ascension to heaven, which is commemorated at the Dome of the Rock. After the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem in the 7th century, the city became the third holiest site in Islam. It outlines the religious significance of Jerusalem to Muslims and the establishment of Islamic architecture and institutions in the city. Jerusalem is a city that has been constantly contested, with its significance leading to frequent power struggles, invasions, and conflicts. This book delves into the Crusades, when Christians sought to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule, and the subsequent reconquests and shifting control of the city between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish powers. This book would not be complete without discussing Palestine and modern Israel. It discusses how Jerusalem's spiritual importance continues to fuel political struggles. This book revolves around three themes. First, religious significance. It highlights how Jerusalem has evolved into a spiritual center for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, each faith imbuing the city with different religious meanings and values. Second, conflict and coexistence. It addresses the deep-rooted tensions between these faiths as they have historically fought for control of the city. At the same time, it highlights moments of coexistence and collaboration between them. And third, historical continuity and change. It emphasizes the city's enduring sacredness, even as its political, rulers, and populations have shifted over the centuries. This book has been praised for its balanced approach and scholarly depth. The author remains subjective while navigating through complex and sensitive topics, offering a historical lens to understand the religious and political significance of the city. Her ability to connect historical events with contemporary issues makes it particularly relevant. While it provides a deep historical narrative, it also touches on the emotional and spiritual connections that people have with Jerusalem, making it clear why the city has remained a flashpoint for millennia. This book is a comprehensive and insightful examination of one of the world's most contested and revered cities. It provides a historical narrative that underscores why Jerusalem holds such profound significance for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and why it continues to be a site of deep religious devotion and political conflict. If you are interested in history, religion, or the Middle East, this book is essential to understand the complexities of Jerusalem. You can get it using the links in the description. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you. Assalamualaikum. Palestine, a 4,000-year history by Noor Masalha. Did you know that the name Palestine can be traced back to the late Bronze Age? If anyone says Palestine doesn't exist, give that person this book. This 448-page book explores the rich history of Palestine and its people. It starts at the late Bronze Age and takes the readers through the periods of the classical antiquity, the Hellenistic empires, Roman Palestine, Byzantine Palestine, Arab Christian Palestine, June Palestine, to the present day. It quotes sources from credible travelers and historians such as Ptolemy and Ibn Battuta. Palestine has always been a land of diverse people, culture, and faith. For millenniums, the people have lived together in peace, respecting each other's beliefs and practices. This rich culture in history is what the Zionists have attempted to erase and rewrite in order to legitimize their claim on the Promised Land. Palestine was not a land without people. Unlike the indigenous Arabs, the European Zionist settlers have no root in Palestine and have to indigenize themselves by stealing everything Palestinian. You can get this book using the links in the description to learn about the rich history of Palestine. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Night in Gaza by Max Gilbert. I don't understand the Palestinians. I don't understand their strength and resilience. I don't understand how they withstand decades of brutal occupation and oppression. What is even more incomprehensible is the silence of the international community. Why do so many of us choose to not see and let evil prevail? This book is an account of what Dr. Max Gilbert witnessed at Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza in the summer of 2014, when once again Israel bombarded Gaza. The majority of the people injured and killed by Israel were children and women, unarmed civilians. This book is important because it documents what happened when Israel attacked Gaza. Western mainstream media would not tell this story, would not let you see the human cost of a war on unarmed civilians. Maybe they are afraid that if more people wake up to the brutal reality of Israel's crime, our voice will become loud enough and strong enough to bring an end to the occupation and demand justice for the victims. Reading the stories was difficult. Looking at the photos was heartbreaking. I don't have the words to succinctly describe the emotions I felt while reading it. How is one supposed to feel when one sees so much pain and suffering inflicted on a people? It made me feel helpless. It left me wishing I could do more. Why do we let decades of injustice to continue? Dr. Gilbert's plea to the then President Barack Obama became famous, and I quote, "Mr. Obama, do you have a heart? I invite you, spend one night, just one night, with us in Shifa, disguised as a cleaner maybe. I am convinced 100% it would change history." End of quote. In the description, there is a link to an interview with Dr. Max Gilbert and links to online bookstores. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. I was afraid to read the prisoner's diaries, afraid of the horror and pain I might find within its pages, which was why the book sat idly on my coffee table for a few months before I finally picked it up and started reading. Did you know that under the administrative detention and the bizarre legal system of the only democracy in the Middle East, Israel can detain Palestinians indefinitely and without charge or trial? A person can be held for years, even decades, under administrative detention. Did you know that over 40% of Palestinian men in the West Bank have spent time in Israeli detention or prisons, and no Palestinian family have not been touched by the scourge of mass imprisonment as a mechanism of suppression? Since the beginning of Israeli occupation, over 800,000 Palestinians have been detained by Israel, which is about 20% of the total Palestinian population in the occupied territories. This book is a collection of stories written by Palestinians held in Israeli prisons. 16, 18, 22, 24, 29, 32, 33 years. That was how long they were imprisoned for the crime of wanting to free their homeland from occupation. Hassan Salama was held in solitary confinement for 13 years. All of them speak of the pain of separation from their loved ones. Yet, those are the people who give them strength to face the cruelty of their jailers. Parents missed their children's childhood. Fathers miss giving away their daughters at their weddings. When Kaira al-Asadi was imprisoned, 2 of her children were sent to an orphanage, and she still didn't know the fate of the other 2. When Palestinians arrive at the prisons, they face interrogation and torture, which may last months. The Israelis do not discriminate between men and women when it came to torturing their prisoners. For women, there is also the threat of rape. During one of the interrogation sessions that Sana Shihada had to endure, the jailers brought a mobile phone and called her mother. They threatened to demolish her home and made her listen to the sound of bulldozers surrounding her home and the shouting of her parents as they tried to stop the demolition. A cat found its way into Walfa Albi's prison cell and became her companion. The cat gave birth to kittens, and they became Wafa's source of joy. When the jailers found the cats and knew they made her happy, they killed the cats and threw them into the garbage. Denial of medical attention is common, if not standard practice. When a prisoner is allowed to see a doctor, the treatment is used as another tool to humiliate them. As I read the final pages of this book, I felt deep respect and awe for the Palestinians. I envy them because I'm not sure I have the courage and strength to endure what they endure. Free Palestine. Assalamu alaikum. Rise and Kill Fest, the secret history of Israel's targeted assassinations. Since the inception of the illegal state of Israel, it has strived to protect its existence by eliminating anyone it sees as a threat. Israel was founded on violence. Since World War II, it has assassinated more people than any other country in the Western world. The Zionists are even willing to commit acts of violence against fellow Jews. Jacob de Haan was a Dutch-born Haredi, an ultra-Orthodox Jew who lived in Jerusalem in the early 1920s. He was a propagandist for the Haredi belief that only the Messiah could establish a Jewish state. He was an anti-Zionist. Itzhak Ben-Zvi, a Haganah leader, ordered his termination. 2 assassins shot him 3 times as he left a synagogue. I have never been able to understand how, after escaping the horrors of the Holocaust, the Zionist Jews could turn around and did the same to another people. When no one wanted the Jewish refugees, Palestinians took them in and gave them a second chance. They turned around and kicked Palestinians out of their homes and land. Nehemiah Mary was a Holocaust survivor of a Jewish family from Poland. When he was 12, the German Gestapo rounded up the Jews in his village, marched them to a nearby forest, and ordered them to dig a pit. They were forced to line up along the edge and was machine-gunned. Mary dived into the pit a split second before they started firing and then laid there quietly, pretending to be dead. After the Gestapo left, he crawled out of the mass grave. After the war, he migrated to Israel and joined a Mossad Shin Bet operational team. He had no qualms about killing anyone perceived as a threat to Israel, and Palestinians are Israel's prime enemy. Mary's story is not unique. Many Israelis think the same way. They believe that Jewish life is more precious than other people's. In their twisted minds, they believe that the only way to keep Jews safe is to eliminate all enemies. The Zionist leaders fed on the trauma of Holocaust survivors to turn them into people willing to do anything under the pretext of keeping Jews safe. Ethan Haber, an Israeli journalist, said that it was immoral to exploit Holocaust horrors to create a killing machine. Israel does not limit its operation within its border. While they have no qualms about murdering Arabs as collateral damage, they always took care to not kill Europeans within the vicinity of their target. The Palestinian resistance was not the only target. Israel also targeted scientists working in the weapon programs in what it perceived as enemy countries. Mossad systematically terrorized the scientists working with enemy governments by threatening their life and families. If that did not intimidate them into quitting, the scientists were marked for assassination. Israel has always been ruthless, not because they want to defend what is rightfully theirs, but to hold on to what they stole using violence. The only way they can do that is by trampling on the people they dispossessed. Israelis live in fear because they know that sooner or later their grip on the land they stole will slip away. This book was written from the Israel's perspective, and the Zionists are very adept at playing victim. Palestinians hate Israel because they hate Jews, they say. Never mind the fact that the Zionists expelled 750,000 Palestinians from their homes in 1948 and had repeatedly massacred Palestinians since then. Let's ignore the systematic policies that Israel implements to make Palestinians' life a misery so that they would give up and leave their land. Any people would rebel against oppression. If their oppressor were not the Zionists, Palestinians would still fight back. This pertinent context is left out of the book. Is it worth plowing through this 700-plus page book? Only if you're really into espionage and want to read real-life spy stories. Otherwise, I don't think you'll miss much. You can get this book using the links in the description. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum. In The 13th Tribe, Arthur Koestler traces the origin of Eastern Europe's Jewish population that was largely decimated by the Nazi onslaught during the Second World War. Through extensive research, he discusses the history of a trading empire that was set up by a tribe known as the Khazars. The Khazar Empire was located between the expanding power blocks of Christianity and Islam, and the people were converted to Judaism by their king as a way of standing apart from both. The Khazarians and their wealth were dispersed through the countries of Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Khazar Empire. The Khazarians were not a Semitic people, that they called themselves Jews after their conversion to Judaism is as absurd as the Chinese Muslims calling themselves Arabs. It is their descendants who later started the campaign for European Jews to return to Palestine, a land their ancestors never set foot on. The European Jews, i.e., descendants of Khazarians, were not descendants of Prophet Abraham, therefore bringing into question the legality of their claim on the Promised Land. This book had been out of print for many years and has only recently been republished. In the description, there is a link to free PDF download, or if you prefer a physical book, there is a link to an online bookshop.
Assalamu alaikum. Whose Land, Whose Promise by Gary Birch explores the issue of the Promised Land and Christian support for Israel. What was God's promise to Abraham? Was the promise unconditional? Are Christians expected to support Israel because those who bless Israel will be blessed? Since the birth of Israel, a moment celebrated by millions of Christians, many people have suffered. Since 1948, over 400 Arab villages have been either destroyed by bulldozers or occupied by Israeli residents, despite UN resolutions calling for the rightful return of these homes and lands to their Arab owners. According to UN records, in June 1999, about 3.6 million Palestinian refugees have been the victims of Israel's nationhood. Palestinian refugee community is the largest in the world. In order to understand the issue of the Promised Land in the correct context, it is imperative that we understand the events that led to the formation of Israel. The plot to steal Palestinian land started long before the Holocaust. In 1895, Theodore Herzl wrote in his diary that the removal of Arabs from Palestine is part of the Zionist plan. Joseph Witz stated that there is no room for Arabs in the country. He wanted Israel without Arabs. Ben-Gurion wanted to prevent Arabs who fled from returning. To guarantee that, villages were destroyed and wells were poisoned with typhus and dysentery bacteria. When an entire town became sick, Jewish forces occupied the town and looted Arab homes. In 1948, Israeli planes dropped leaflets in Palestinian villages warning people to get out or be killed. After they left, Israeli settlers simply moved into Palestinian homes. In some villages, the Israeli forces carried out mass arrest of all males aged 14 to 60. They were taken to detention camps where they were tortured by the Shin Bet. Israel was built by conquest and confiscation of another people's land, resulting in millions of refugees. Israel confiscates land that are of strategic value for water, agriculture, and military advantage. This is the game played for centuries by whoever that wants to control the land. Israel also steals water. The average Israeli consumes 348 liters of water a day, but the average Palestinian is only given 70 liters. If Palestinians want more water, they have to pay 4 times the price. In the summer of 1998, 500,000 Palestinians were without water for 2 months. Palestinians had to watch their children go thirsty, while Jewish settlers next door watered their gardens and swam in their pools. In 2006, when Hamas won the election, Israel imposed a blockade that paralyzed Gaza. In 2009, the US State Department offered scholarships to disadvantaged Gazans. Israel imposed a travel ban so that the students cannot leave Gaza, and the scholarships were eventually cancelled. This is one of many quiet persecutions to cultivate toxic levels of despair among Palestinians. The pertinent questions are: what was God's covenant with Abraham? What was the promise? The package deal includes the following. Firstly, Abraham would receive the land as an everlasting possession. Abraham's posterity will become a great nation. Third, an everlasting covenant will bind Abraham and his descendants to God. And finally, all people of the earth will be blessed through Abraham and his descendants. However, the promise was conditional. The land is to be an everlasting possession, provided Abraham and his descendants remain faithful in their relationship with God. Possessing the land was contingent to Israel's consistently living by God's righteous standards. If Israel defied God's law, the land itself will eject them out. Breaking the law means losing the land. Who really owns the land? Leviticus 25:23 states that Israel does not own the land. God does. Israel is a tenant, not the landlord. The first 6 books of the Bible never used the phrase the land of Israel, but calls it the land of Canaan. Sarah, Abraham's wife, died at Kiriath Arba, which is present-day Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Abraham decided to bury Sarah at a certain plot of land and went to see the landowner to offer him a fair price for it. He didn't demand that the land was surrendered to him because God gave him the land. How are Israelites instructed to deal with people who were already living in the land before they arrived? Land and righteousness are linked. Fidelity to covenant righteousness is a prerequisite to enjoying the blessing of the covenant. When any generation neglects the covenant, the land is conquered by foreign power. The nation built by Saul, David, and Solomon was not culturally monolithic, not the Jewish state that present-day Israel aims to be. During the time of Saul, David, and Solomon, non-Jews were neither marginalized nor expelled. Different cultures were integrated into mainstream national life. Keeping the land hinges on obeying the law. The aliens who lived along Israelites should not be oppressed or discriminated. Leviticus 19:33-34 remind Israelites that there were once aliens in Egypt. Israel was commanded to create a society that stood the test of its goodness in how they treat non-Israelites. For example, David paid fair market price for a piece of land he bought. By failing to treat aliens fairly, Israel has forgotten not only its theological history, but also its own suffering in 20th century Europe. The Old Testament links justice to the land. Prophets like Jeremiah, Amos, Isaiah, and Ezekiel had little patience for those who ignored righteousness. Kings who destroyed innocent people and their homes soon faced a prophet. For example, Ahab faced Elijah, and King David was disqualified from building God's holy temple because he slaughtered many people. Prophets warned against aggressive taking of lands or abuse of landowners. Every Old Testament prophet repeats the same thing. Covenant land promise is tied to obeying God's law, and Israel's violation of the law would lead to the necessary judgment. Jeremiah identified many wrongs, among them abuse of resident aliens who live in the land. If orphans, widows, and aliens are abused, God will refuse to dwell with Israel in the land. God sent prophets to warn Israelites when they strayed from God's law. Prophets who warned them that God's promise is contingent on them being righteous. If they didn't mend their ways, they were expelled from the land. For example, in 586 BC, Babylonian armies conquered the land and destroyed Jerusalem and took survivors captive. Who are the prophets of modern-day Israel? Many Israeli groups decry the abuses of Palestinians by the Israeli government. Among them are ICAT, B'Tselem, Neturei Karta, and Jewish Voice for Peace. Rabbis for Human Rights organizes walks along the occupation barrier and read from Isaiah 1:27. Judaism is not the problem, secularism is. Post-Zionist scholars have been challenging fundamental myths about the foundation of Israel, such as a land with no people for a people without land. Also challenge are stories about ill-equipped Holocaust survivors facing a hostile British government and Arabs who wanted to annihilate them. The truth is, the Israel army was superior in every respect. Jerusalem had a long non-Jewish history before it was captured by King David. It was conquered and destroyed within 700 years. Destruction and exile were interpreted as judgment by God. Jesus emphasized this judgment in his vineyard and the tenants parable. After Roman expulsion of Jews from Jerusalem in 135 CE, they lost control of the city for over 1800 years. Looking at the historical cultural dominance in Jerusalem, Israel's historic claim is only a small portion of history. Arab claim to Jerusalem is significant. For the last 2,000 years, Judaism dominated Jerusalem for only 200 years. In 2012, there were 98 checkpoints in the West Bank and 57 of them were internal. The wall isolates and excludes Palestinian communities that were part of Jerusalem so that they have no access to Jerusalem. The separation wall is not about security. It's about economic control because these areas are forced to trade with Israel for goods and services. Often, the barrier does not divide Arabs and Jews. It hems in Palestinians so that they cannot contact each other. Assuming that there is a continuity between the Old Testament and the 21st century, how does Israel's national life compare with the life of God's people outlined in the Bible? If Israel qualifies prophetically, does it also qualify ethically and morally to be God's people in the land? Israel's occupation and oppressive policies against Palestinians clearly break the righteousness code required to abide by God's law. In 1975, US classifies Zionism as racism. In 1998, the Association of Civil Rights in Israel accused the government of race-based discrimination. Allegra Pacheco, a Brooklyn-born Jew, defends Palestinians in Israeli courts because she is deeply offended by Israeli discrimination. She stated that a Jewish state can never be democratic to all its citizens. Even though this book was written for a Christian audience, I recommend it for anyone who would like to understand the issue from a biblical perspective. You can get this book using the links in the description. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you. Assalamualaikum. The Other Side of the Wall, a Palestinian Christian narrative of lament and hope by Mantha Isaac. People rarely talk about Palestinian Christians and how they too have suffered under Israeli occupation. Most of the Christian world pretends they don't exist because acknowledging that Palestinian Christians exist would put a big question mark on Christian support for the oppressor of their fellow Christians. The author is a pastor at a Lutheran church in Bethlehem. He starts his story by relating how an invitation for him to speak at a Christian conference was withdrawn. This happened numerous times, and not just to him. When certain parties heard that a Palestinian Christian had been invited as a speaker, they pressured the conference organizers to withdraw the invitation. He asks an important question: why are Palestinian Christians silenced and discredited? The author presents the arguments that Christians have used to justify their support for Israel and his arguments against them. For example, they often quote Genesis 12:13, God will bless those who bless Israel and the Jews and curse those who curse them. He points out that the verse is a mandate to Abraham to become a blessing to all nations, which was fulfilled in Jesus. The author also poses the question of whether the state of Israel today is the Israel mentioned in the Bible. Then there is the question of to whom does the land belong? The Bible provides clear answers. God's promise to Abraham was conditional. The demand of holiness applies to all its inhabitants equally. Leviticus warns that if Israel does not keep the Lord's statutes, the land would vomit them out, as it did the nations before them. The prophet Ezekiel proclaims that sojourners should be allotted an inheritance among the Israelites and that they should be treated as native-born children of Israel. The author argues that the land is meant to be inclusive and universal, unlike Israel's desire to make it an exclusive Jewish state. While the Zionists used the Torah and Judaism to justify the founding of Israel, if we scrutinize the arguments, we will find that there is nothing in the religion that supports the colonization of Palestine and the expulsion of its people. The founding fathers of Israel were atheist Zionists. How can people not see the irony? Israel is a secular state that uses the Torah and Judaism to justify the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. If a Muslim tries to impose the Quran on non-Muslims, people would be incensed. So why is it acceptable to impose the Torah on non-Jews and the Bible on non-Christians? The voice of Palestinian Christians must be heard. Below there is a link to the author's Christmas sermon that had gone viral, and there's a link to an interview with him. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you.